Welcome to this video to replace our normal class on Friday, April 21st, 2017. You should probably go to the module for this day and watch the pre-class video. This, video is about steroids and another class of molecule called sterols. And sterols are steroids with an OH group or hydroxyl group. These are both considered to be lipids, and that's why we're talking about them in this particular chapter. All steroids and sterols have a very unique ring signature, if you will. There are 4 fused rings: A, B, C, D. When you see this arrangement of rings, then that is kind of a signal to you that you have a steroid, and if it has an OH group, it's a sterol. Absolutely, the most famous sterol is cholesterol, and we see the structure here down below, and it is a sterol because it's got this hydroxyl group right there, and it's got the ABCD ring system. Steroids and sterols differ from each other because this ABCD ring system can be decorated, if you will, with different chemical groups. Well, what do we know about cholesterol? Well, we know cholesterol is essential. There's a couple of important biological functions of cholesterol. It helps modulate biological membrane fluidity. We've talked about membranes already, and they have to have a certain fluidity. They have to be somewhere between liquid-like and solid-like to really do their job properly. Cholesterol is said to kind of fit in between the membrane bilayer and help modulate membrane fluidity. Another thing about cholesterol that is important, essential, is that it is a precursor to other steroids and sterols. And we'll see a few of those in a few minutes. However, and I think we all know this, too much cholesterol can be highly problematic. Now, we make cholesterol in our bodies, and we also get it from our diet, much like this kind of burrito here. It probably has a pretty good bit of cholesterol in it. Now, the problem is too much cholesterol can lead to a condition called atherosclerosis. Or hardening of the arteries, and you get these fairly significant kind of plaques formed in the arteries, and you get restricted blood flow. Which can lead to some fairly significant cardiovascular problems. So, the good and bad with cholesterol. So, here are some other steroids and sterols. We see here on the screen a plant sterol, and we see a sterol from fungi and yeast, and then this one is an important one. Testosterone is the male sex hormone. It is made from cholesterol through a series of biosynthetic reactions. And then we have another important, this would be, I guess testosterone is also a sterol because it has a OH group, although it's usually called a steroid hormone, but it is technically a sterol. It's a molecule called sodium cholate. Everyone should take a moment and say thank you, sodium cholate, because it does play a very important role, especially in our digestive process. It is called a bile salt, and you can see it is a salt. It's a sodium salt of a sterol, and it is what we call an emulsifier. Which basically solubilizes tags from our diet. Remember, tags, triglycerides or triacylglycerols. It's the most abundant lipid in our diet. We take in a pretty good bit of tags in our diet, and they are very nonpolar. Therefore, how are we going to digest them if they are not soluble in water? So sodium cholate hooks up with, if you want to say that, interacts with triacylglycerols and makes them more soluble in water. Hence why I say solubilizes tags. This makes them available for digestion by dietary lipases. And we've talked about lipases in this class before. They are enzymes that break down triacylglycerols or triglycerides. So the point of page 2 here is that, yeah, cholesterol is a important sterol. It's a precursor for two important molecules. One is testosterone, and the other is sodium cholate, which is a dietary emulsifier, which helps make triacylglycerols more soluble in water and able to be digested by dietary lipases. All right, well, let's keep rolling here. There are some other steroids that are very important in our life. These are synthetic. These have been man-made. These do not occur naturally. Two of them are called prednisolone, and one is called prednisone. And if you've ever gone to the doctor and you've had severe congestion, then you may have been prescribed a steroid pack. And this is what we have here. And it is technically methylprednisolone. So it's a derivative, a methyl derivative of prednisone. These steroids, these called corticoid steroids, have potent anti-inflammatory properties. These are potent agents to fight inflammation. And so that's why we take them when we are severely congested. You have to have a prescription for methylprednisolone, and for a long time to get steroids of this type you would have to have a prescription. But there's a whole host of new corticoid steroids that are actually available over the counter, and you may have seen some commercials for these. One of the more popular one is Nasacort, where you can get over the counter. And we see here the structure of Nasacort is analogous, similar to prednisone or prednisolone. Again, these have anti-inflammatory properties. Now, why do steroids have anti-inflammatory properties? Well, that's a good question, and I'm glad you asked. So here's the fairly complex story of all of this. Okay, so let's start here. Over here to the left, and remember we had our old friends, the membrane lipids. So this is from a biological membrane. They have membrane lipids, glycerophospholipids, if you will. I call these GPLs, glycerophospholipids, assemble together to make a membrane bilayer. And if you take one of these membrane lipids out and look at it, then we know, and we said this in class, there's a glycerol backbone, there's a polar head group, and then there's two fatty acids esterified to the glycerol. That was a membrane lipid. Contrast that to a tag molecule. It's slightly different. one of the fatty acids, that can be in a membrane lipid is called arachidonic acid, and it is in this kind of, I don't know, mustard colored box, this yellow box here. It is one of the known biologically relevant fatty acids, and if we write the code, it has 20 carbons, it has 4 double bonds, and it's going to be delta, and I know this because we were already partially numbered here. 4, 5, delta 5, 8, 11, 14. Okay? It's also, if you want to do the omega numbering, just for the fun of it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so it is an N minus 6. This is a very important fatty acid, folks. This is super important, arachidonic acid. Can it be in a membrane lipid? Yes. Now, what we know is that there is an enzyme called phospholipase A2. And as the notes already say, phospholipase A2 catalyzes the release of arachidonic acid from the membrane. So this enzyme will come along, and we'll talk about what enzymes are later on in this class, but they're protein catalysts, and they can do a variety of things, and they can break chemical bonds as one of them. So phospholipase A2 comes along and cleaves the ester bond and releases arachidonic acid from the membrane. It is released as arachidonic acid. In fact, it does this through a process called hydrolysis, and we already know all about that. But this is enzyme catalyzed hydrolysis. Once you release arachidonic acid from the membrane, and again this happens all the time, then you get free arachidonic acid away from the membrane, and then through some biosynthetic steps you can make a class of molecules called eicosanoids. Some eicosanoids are involved in pain and inflammation. Now, so if you want, one way to do this, or really our goal is to relieve pain or stop inflammation, is to prevent synthesis of these molecules called eicosanoids. How do corticosteroids have anti-inflammatory properties? They block phospholipase A2. They basically inhibit the activity of this enzyme. So phospholipase A2 can't work anymore. And if phospholipase A2 doesn't work, then arachidonic acid is not released. So I call this a detail train. Let's get on the detail train. Get off the struggle bus and get on the detail train is what I like to say. Is if you block phospholipase A2, what's next? You do not release arachidonic acid from the membrane. And if you do not release arachidonic acid from the membrane, then you basically have a much lower level of pain. Well, in this case, it's really inflammation we're talking about. So you are severely restricting inflammation, and that's what we wanted. So how do corticosteroids work? They block an enzyme called phospholipase A2. They inhibit its activity. If that activity is inhibited, you do not release our friend the fatty acid arachidonic acid, and then arachidonic acid can't make eicosanoids, which are involved in pain and inflammation. Well, we know long-term use of steroids to treat inflammation has been shown to be somewhat problematic, and I think even the new steroids available, we just don't know. You still have to be careful how long you take these and how often you take them. So there was a big effort years and years ago to try to develop a new type of pain relieving molecule that relieves pain and inflammation. Okay, well, here we are on page 5. Here we see arachidonic acid that's released, and arachidonic acid is converted to prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. Okay, and I've given you the biological function of all 3 of these types of molecules. Well, to go from arachidonic acid to pain and inflammation, or to go from arachidonic acid to prostaglandins, and we require an enzyme called COX, called cyclooxygenase. And again, these prostaglandins are what's causing us some problems, because these prostaglandins lead to pain and inflammation. So they have a lot of different functions, but the 2 that we're really concerned about in this class are pain and inflammation. So isn't it true, ladies and gentlemen, that, okay, if arachidonic acid is released from the membrane, but if we could prevent it from being converted to prostaglandins, then that would basically decrease pain and inflammation. And so really what was developed was a class of drugs that can inhibit cyclooxygenase, can inhibit COX. And these are called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And we've mentioned those before, and we'll meet some of these in a few minutes. But NSAIDs, they inhibit, or they block the activity of cyclooxygenase. And basically the bottom line is they prevent formation of prostaglandins. And if you prevent the formation of prostaglandins, here we are we're on another detail train. Hang on, okay? Then we basically lower pain and inflammation. I'm running out of room, but you get the point. So, there's 2 ways to do this here. We talked about the steroids, blocking phospholipase A2, and arachidonic acid is not even released from the membrane. If it's not released from the membrane, it can't do anything. But if it is released from the membrane, we have another way to block these prostaglandins, which are really pain molecules, inflammation molecules, by blocking their formation, the formation of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid, and that happens through the COX enzyme. And there's a COX1 and a COX2, which we're not going to get too deep into, but there's 2 varieties of it. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs block the activity of the COX enzyme. If you do that, then you basically relieve pain and inflammation because you're not forming prostaglandins. Now, what are some of these NSAID drugs? Well, here we go. They're the big pain relievers. Aspirin, naproxen sodium, and ibuprofen are the major NSAIDs that have been in use for quite a long time. And again, just so we're on the same page, they inhibit the COX enzymes. And when they do this, they block prostaglandin formation. And if you block prostaglandin formation, then you relieve pain and inflammation, because prostaglandins are pain molecules, inflammation molecules. Now, here's the issue though. Overuse of these types of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, chronic use of these, causes a major problem. They can cause, and this has been very well documented and demonstrated, gastric ulceration. And I'm going to give that the old frowny face. Now, I'm not saying don't take aspirin or ibuprofen or Aleve. I'm just saying, hey, Don't be on, if you're taking this, you're taking 2 or 3 tablets a day, that's a problem, because over time this is really going to cause this sores and ulceration in the stomach. And so there was a big effort about a decade ago to try to develop a new class of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that could relieve pain and inflammation, but not cause this gastric ulceration. Now, these NSAIDs on this page, they inhibit both COX-1 and COX-2. So they are what we call non-selective COX inhibitors. Because they inhibit both of these equally. Well, what to kind of cut to the chase here, what we know is that if you could selectively inhibit COX number 2, then there was some promise that you could decrease the synthesis of prostaglandins associated with pain and inflammation. That's good, because that's what we want. Plus, it was believed, and this is somewhat true, you would lower, or you would prevent gastric ulceration. But again, these have to be COX-2 selective inhibitors, a whole new class, not aspirin, not ibuprofen, not naproxen. These had to be selective COX-2 inhibitors. Okay, so this is good. We are limiting gastric ulceration, we are relieving pain. These were, for many years, billion-dollar drugs. And the major players here were Celebrex, Bextra, Vioxx, and Prexigi, I think is how you say that. And again, these made the drug companies billions of dollars, and they also relieved a lot of pain for people. Okay, so these were $1 billion drugs. However, over long-term studies of people who took these drugs, there was a major issue, and this was an increased risk of heart attack. So I'm going to give that the frowny face. So these COX-2 selective inhibitors were very, very promising. They relieve pain and inflammation by blocking prostaglandin formation. They didn't have as much, or I guess not, maybe I wouldn't say not at all, but at least reduced gastric ulceration that's associated with the non-selective COX inhibitors. So that was a win-win right there. But over time, some of these COX-2 selective inhibitors have been shown clearly to increase the risk of heart attack. And you know what happens when that comes along? The lawyers get involved. So here's kind of you may be entitled to money damages. It's Vioxx. Vioxx was one that was highly problematic, and it was removed from the market and I'm just going to say the mid-2000s. So it's not really available anymore. But Celebrex, which is very useful, particularly useful for treating arthritis, remains on the market today. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have severe chronic arthritis and Celebrex is the only thing that will relieve your pain, is it worth it to you to have an increased risk of heart attack to relieve your pain? And the answer to that question for some people is clearly yes, it is worth the risk. People who take Celebrex have to be monitored fairly closely for their cardiovascular health. But if this is going to be the thing that relieves your chronic pain, then some people have decided that it's worth a increased risk of heart attack. So Celebrex remains on the market. And in fact, some studies have shown recently that it's not as dangerous as some of these other COX-2 selective inhibitors. So this one actually remains on the market. And you will see some commercials for Celebrex on TV and some other places. This is our kind of tour of steroids, and then we kind of got into icosanoids. And so there is a quiz over this video, and I would also watch the pre-class video. And hey, whenever you're listening to this, either Friday or on the weekend, I hope this was useful, and that's it. See you later.